The story of the American Civil Rights Movement is the story of a 100-year war. It begins not in the 1950s, but in the 1890s, with a promise of freedom, a devastating legal betrayal, and the construction of a fortress of oppression. This is the story of how that fortress, called Jim Crow, was built, and how a generation of brilliant lawyers, trained activists, and ordinary citizens tore it down, brick by brick. We will witness the legal genius of Thurgood Marshall as he wages a 10-year war against the separate but equal lie. We'll see the spark of a movement ignited by the strategic courage of Rosa Parks and the rise of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s philosophy of nonviolence. We'll explore the brutal, massive resistance from governors who stood in schoolhouse doors, the internal split in the movement with the rise of Black Power, and the final, bloody confrontation at a bridge in Selma, Alabama, that forced a president to act. This is part one of a nation remade. The legal betrayals, the brutal obstacles, the clashing philosophies, and the ultimate legislative victories that defined the African American civil rights movement. This is the foundation of modern American history. To understand the full story, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel.
The United States was ripped apart and sutured back together by 3 constitutional amendments, known as the Reconstruction Amendments. These fundamentally altered the fabric of American citizenship. This was the clean break. It formally and permanently abolished slavery and involuntary servitude in the United States. This is arguably the most important amendment after the Bill of Rights. It grants birthright citizenship, meaning anyone born in the U.S. is a citizen. More importantly, it contains the phrases that are the legal bedrock of the entire 20th century movement: due process of law and equal protection of the laws. For the first time, this amendment declared that state governments, not just the federal government, could not deny citizens these rights. This amendment was a direct refutation of the Supreme Court's infamous 1857 Dred Scott v. Sanford decision, which had ruled that Black people were not citizens and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. This amendment was intended to secure the political power of this new citizenry. It explicitly states that the right to vote cannot be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The promise was short-lived. Following the contested election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877, federal troops were withdrawn from the South, and the federal government abandoned its commitment to protecting the rights of freedmen. The final nail in Reconstruction's coffin came in 1896 with the landmark case of Plessy versus Ferguson. It was a deliberate act of civil disobedience, much like Rosa Parks' protest 60 years later. The activist committee recruited Homer Plessy, a man who was 7/8 white and 1/8 Black, to be their test case by sitting in the whites-only car. The plan backfired spectacularly. The Supreme Court ruled 7-1 against Plessy, creating the devastating legal doctrine of separate but equal. The court declared that segregation did not violate the 14th Amendment, as long as the separate facilities provided to each race were equal. The lone dissenting vote, Justice John Marshall Harlan, wrote one of the most famous dissents in history. He correctly predicted the decision would prove to be quite as pernicious as the decision in the Dred Scott case. He declared, "Our Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens." Plessy versus Ferguson was not just about train cars. It was a legal green light for the total segregation of American society. It gave constitutional blessing for the states to construct the entire system of Jim Crow. That legal green light from Plessy versus Ferguson allowed states to construct a total system of oppression. But what did that system actually look like? In practice, equal was always a lie. It wasn't just a sign on the train car. It was a comprehensive fortress of control with 3 distinct walls: law, etiquette, and terror. The first wall was the law itself, designed for the complete suppression of voting to neutralize the promise of the 15th Amendment. A complex matrix of laws was enacted across the South to disenfranchise black citizens. States used poll taxes, fees that were an insurmountable barrier for impoverished sharecroppers. They also used property tests, allowing only property owners to vote, which disenfranchised the landless. These were instruments of fraud, designed to be impassable. A black applicant with a PhD might be asked an impossible question, while an illiterate white applicant would be instantly passed. This was the explicit whites-only loophole. It stated that if your father or grandfather was eligible to vote before 1867, you were exempt from the literacy and property tests. This, of course, only applied to white citizens. In the solid South, winning the Democratic primary was the real election. The party declared itself a private club, legally barring black Americans from participating in the only election that counted. States enacted laws that permanently stripped voting rights from anyone convicted of a felony. These laws were specifically crafted to target crimes that the drafters felt would be mostly committed by black people. Jim Crow was more than just laws. It was a set of pervasive social rules designed to enforce the day-to-day inferiority of black people. These etiquette norms were a constant psychological burden. Social interactions were rigidly controlled. A black male could never offer his hand to shake a white male's hand, as it implied social equality. Black and white people were forbidden from eating together. Even a gesture, like a black man offering to light a white female's cigarette, was forbidden, as it implied intimacy. Naming conventions were another tool of humiliation. White people never used courtesy titles, Mr., Mrs., Miss, when addressing black people, who were called by their first names. Black people, in contrast, had to use courtesy titles for all white people. This humiliation extended to all parts of life. If a black person rode in a car driven by a white person, they had to sit in the back seat. These rules, combined with separate water fountains and restrooms, created a universe of daily humiliation, reinforcing the feeling of inferiority that the Supreme Court would later condemn. The third layer of Jim Crow was overt terror, designed to punish any who dared to challenge the laws or the etiquette. The Ku Klux Klan, KKK, served as the terrorist wing of this system. The Klan surged again in the 1950s and 60s, specifically to oppose the civil rights movement. Their most infamous act was the September 15, 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama, which killed 4 young girls. White Citizens Councils. But focusing only on the KKK misses the true power structure. Respectable white leaders formed white citizens' councils, composed of bankers and business leaders and clergy. They were known as the Uptown Klan. Instead of bombs, they used economic coercion. If a black man tried to register to vote, the council would ensure he was fired from his job, his family evicted, or the bank called in his mortgage. This combination of overt terror from the KKK and respectable economic warfare from the citizens' councils created an almost inescapable system of control. This comprehensive system of legal, social, and physical control was almost inescapable, but its foundation was Plessy v. Ferguson. To tear the walls down, the movement had to first wage a brilliant legal war in the courtroom, led by the NAACP and its chief counsel, Thurgood Marshall. Marshall's strategy was genius. Don't attack separate but equal head-on. Instead, attack the equal part. used the courts to force the states to provide truly equal facilities, knowing they would be unable or unwilling to bear the massive expense. This would expose separate but equal as the functional lie it always was. The first major crack came from Texas. Heman Marion Sweatt, a black mail carrier from Houston, applied for admission to the all-white University of Texas School of Law in 1946. He was denied solely because of his race. Sued by Sweatt and the NAACP, Texas scrambled to find a solution. The state created the School of Law of the Texas State University for Negroes. This school was located in a basement in Austin, with a few part-time faculty and limited access to the state's law library. The case reached the Supreme Court. In a unanimous decision, the court ordered Heman Sweatt's admission to the University of Texas. Now, this is the crucial part. The court did not overturn Plessy. Instead, it ruled that the new school was simply not equal. But Marshall had convinced them to look beyond tangible factors, like books, and consider intangible factors for the first time. The reputation of the faculty, the experience of the administration, and the prestige of the degree. The Sweatt decision was a legal masterstroke. It made it clear that separate but equal was an impossible standard to meet, especially in graduate education, and set the stage for the total demolition of segregation. Just as the NAACP was challenging the black-white binary, another critical Texas case challenged the 14th Amendment's application to other minorities, Hernandez v. Texas. Pete Hernandez, a Mexican-American agricultural worker, was convicted of murder by an all-Anglo jury in Jackson County, Texas. His lawyers argued his 14th Amendment equal protection rights were violated, since no person of Mexican ancestry had served on a jury in that county for 25 years. Texas's argument was shocking. They claimed the 14th Amendment only applied to the black-white dynamic. Since Mexican Americans were legally classified as white, Texas claimed they had no grounds to complain about discrimination. Hernandez's lawyers, Gus Garcia and Carlos Cadena, had to prove that Mexican Americans were, in fact, treated as a separate and other class. Their evidence was brilliant, and it came from the courthouse itself. In the public restroom, there were 2 toilets, one unmarked for white men, and a second marked colored men and hombres aquí, men here. This was the gotcha moment. The Supreme Court, in another unanimous decision, agreed. Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote that the attitude of the community proved that Mexican Americans were treated as a class apart. This was the first time the Supreme Court applied 14th Amendment protections to a group other than Black Americans. It set a vital precedent that equal protection of the laws was not a black-white issue, but a universal right. With Sweatt proving that equal was a fiction, and Hernandez proving that equal protection was for everyone, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP were ready. The legal foundation of Plessy was crumbling. They had the strategy, they had the precedents. Now they were ready for the knockout punch. Marshall and the NAACP consolidated 5 separate school segregation cases from across the country into the single case that would change America: Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Earl Warren, delivered the unanimous 9-0 decision. Warren had worked tirelessly to get all 9 justices to agree, knowing this moral authority was needed to overcome the inevitable resistance. The court explicitly overturned Plessy v. Ferguson. They declared that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Marshall's team argued that segregation itself was the problem. They famously used social science research known as the doll tests to make their point. This research showed that separating children solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. Therefore, the court concluded, separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Brown v. Board was a legal triumph that, quote, shattered Jim Crow laws. But the victory was not the end of the struggle. It was the beginning of a new, violent phase of resistance. The Supreme Court, in a 1955 follow-up case known as Brown 2, failed to set a firm timetable for desegregation. Instead, it ordered it to proceed only, quote, with all deliberate speed. This vague phrase was seized upon by segregationists as an invitation to delay and defy the law. This defiance was called massive resistance. Southern politicians like Senator Harry Byrd organized this resistance. In 1956, 100 Southern congressmen signed the Southern Manifesto, pledging to use all lawful means to resist integration. This resistance took extreme forms. Prince Edward County, Virginia, took the step of closing their entire public school system for 5 years rather than integrate. This resistance also had another tragic consequence. As districts were forced to integrate, it was often the black schools that were closed. Tens of thousands of highly qualified, experienced black teachers and principals were fired or demoted. The Brown decision was a monumental legal victory, but it was just paper. It tore down the law of segregation, but massive resistance meant nothing had changed in practice. To make the ruling real, the people had to act. The movement needed a spark. It got two. One from the highest office in the land, and one from a humble city bus. The first spark came from the top down. One of the first major federal actions came from President Harry S. Truman. On July 26, 1948, he signed Executive Order 9981. The order was simple but profound. It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. A key catalyst that outraged Truman was the horrific story of Sergeant Isaac Woodard. In 1946, Woodard, a decorated Black World War II veteran, was honorably discharged. While still in his uniform on a bus ride home, he was arrested. The local police chief took him to an alley, beat him savagely, and gouged out his eyes, permanently blinding him. Truman's order set a powerful precedent for federal action. The second spark, the one that truly ignited the mass movement, came from Rosa Parks in Montgomery, Alabama, on December 1st, 1955. The common myth is that Rosa Parks was a tired old seamstress, spontaneously deciding she was too tired to give up her seat. This myth, while poetic, is false, and robs Parks of her agency. Parks was 42, not old, and she was not a political novice. She was a respected community leader and the secretary of the Montgomery chapter of the NAACP. She later explained, "People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired. No, the only tired I was tired of giving in." She had even attended activist training workshops. Her action was not spontaneous. The Montgomery NAACP and the Women's Political Council, WPC, led by Joanne Robinson, had been searching for the perfect plaintiff. 9 months earlier, 15-year-old Claudette Colvin had been arrested for the exact same offense, but leaders worried she wasn't impeccable enough.
Rosa Parks was. When Parks was arrested, Joanne Robinson and the WPC stayed up all night, mimeographing tens of thousands of leaflets calling for a one-day bus boycott. The one-day protest was so successful, leaders formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, to continue it. They needed a new president. They chose a 26-year-old newcomer, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The Montgomery bus boycott lasted for 381 days. The black community organized an intricate carpool system, and the boycott was finally won in court, demonstrating the immense power of nonviolent action.
The 381-day boycott was a success. The mass movement had its strategy, nonviolent direct action, and its new leader, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. With his rise, the movement gained its central philosophy, nonviolent civil disobedience, rooted in Christian teachings and the tactics of Mahatma Gandhi. But this new philosophy would be brutally tested by the massive resistance of the Old South. Dr. King's philosophy is best understood through his two most important written and spoken works. First, the Letter from Birmingham Jail, written in April 1963. King was arrested for leading the Birmingham campaign and wrote in response to 8 white, moderate clergymen who called him an outside agitator and criticized his protests as unwise and untimely. His letter is a foundational text. He responded to the outsider charge by stating, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." To the charge of being untimely, he delivered a powerful rebuke. This wait has almost always meant never. In the letter's most searing passage, King expressed his grave disappointment with the white moderate, who he argued was the greater stumbling block to freedom than the KKK. The moderate, he wrote, is more devoted to order than to justice. His second masterpiece was the I Have a Dream speech, delivered in August 1963 during the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. He argued that the Declaration of Independence was a promissory note, but when Black Americans came to cash that check, it came back marked insufficient funds. This philosophy was translated into disciplined, creative protest tactics. The sit-in movement began in 1960, started by 4 black college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, who sat at a segregated Woolworth's lunch counter. This was disciplined action. Protesters were trained, given rules like do not strike back or curse if abused. They were harassed and had food dumped on them, but they never retaliated. This expanded to wade-ins at whites-only pools and pray-ins at segregated churches. The strategic goal was tactical, to draw a stark contrast between the peaceful, dignified students and the screaming, violent mobs attacking them. When this contrast was broadcast on television, it shocked the conscience of the nation. This nonviolent movement was met with massive, organized resistance from the white Southern power structure. The Southern Manifesto of 1956 was the respectable resistance, where 100 congressmen pledged to use all lawful means to defy the Brown v. Board decision. Governor Orval Faubus of Arkansas personified this. In 1957, when 9 black students, the Little Rock Nine, attempted to integrate Central High School, Faubus called in the Arkansas National Guard to physically block them. This created a constitutional crisis, forcing President Eisenhower to federalize the National Guard and send in the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students to class. Even more defiant was Governor George Wallace of Alabama. In his 1963 inaugural address, he proclaimed, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." Later that year, he engaged in political theater known as the Stand in the Schoolhouse Door, where he physically stood in the doorway of the University of Alabama to block the enrollment of 2 black students. He was forced to step aside by federal marshals. This massive, violent resistance from state governors and police exposed the brutality of the system. But it also came at a great cost. As nonviolent protesters were jailed, beaten, and killed, many activists, particularly in the urban north, began to question the tactic of loving your enemy. This frustration led to a split in the movement and the rise of a new, more militant approach. The frustration boiled over in 1966. During the Meredith March Against Fear in Mississippi, Stokely Carmichael, the new leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, rallied a crowd with a new slogan: "We want Black Power." This slogan electrified young activists, but worried the older generation. Dr. King believed it carried connotations of violence and separatism, and would alienate the white allies he believed were essential. This public disagreement signaled a fundamental split. This new militancy was best embodied by the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, BPP, founded in Oakland, California in 1966 by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale. While both the SCLC and BPP shared the same broad goals of racial equality, their philosophies were a stark contrast. Dr. King's philosophy was nonviolent resistance and integration. The Black Panthers' ideology was Black nationalism and socialism. They did not seek integration. They sought power to determine the destiny of our Black community. Their philosophy was armed self-defense, particularly against police brutality. Their methods were outlined in their 10-point program, which demanded full employment, decent housing, and an immediate end to police brutality and murder of Black people. The media and the FBI focused almost exclusively on the Panthers' militant image. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover famously called the BPP the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. But this focus on the guns misses what may have been their most revolutionary activity: their survival programs. The most famous was the Free Breakfast for Children program, which fed thousands of poor Black children every day. They also ran free health clinics and legal aid offices. This dual strategy, armed self-defense combined with community social programs, is why the FBI targeted them, and why they won such popular support in their communities. The late 1960s saw the movement split into 2 powerful streams. This escalating pressure from both Dr. King's peaceful protests in the South and the rising militant demands in the North created a moral and political crisis that Washington could no longer ignore. The time for legislative action had finally come. This led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the most sweeping civil rights law since Reconstruction. The bill was proposed by President John F. Kennedy, but after his assassination, it fell to his successor, the Texan Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, to see it passed. The bill was met with furious resistance. The congressional bloc of Southern Democrats launched the longest continuous debate in Senate history, a 60-day filibuster to kill the bill. It was finally broken by a bipartisan coalition. The law's provisions were revolutionary. Title II was a direct response to the sit-in movement. It banned discrimination in public accommodations, hotels, restaurants, theaters. Title VII banned discrimination in employment and created the EEC. In a fascinating twist, it also bans discrimination on the basis of sex. This one word, allegedly added by a segregationist to kill the bill, became the legal backbone for the entire second-wave feminist movement. The 1964 Act was weak on voting rights. King and other leaders knew that without political power, legal rights were meaningless. They decided to force the issue with a voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama. The catalyst was Bloody Sunday. On March 7, 1965, activists, led by John Lewis, were brutally attacked by Alabama state troopers with clubs and tear gas as they crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, all in front of national news cameras. The footage of Bloody Sunday horrified the nation. 8 days later, President Johnson went before Congress to demand a new law. In one of the most powerful speeches of his presidency, he adopted the movement's anthem. And we shall overcome. This bill had the teeth the 1964 Act lacked. It banned all literacy tests, poll taxes, and other devices used to disenfranchise voters. Its legal hammer was Section 5, pre-clearance. This required states with a history of voting discrimination to get federal pre-approval from the Justice Department before they could make any changes to their voting laws. The impact was immediate and profound. Within a few years, black voter registration in the South skyrocketed. This led directly to the increased participation of minorities in the political process for the first time since Reconstruction. And so, the 100-year struggle had come full circle. From the broken promise of Plessy v. Ferguson to the total oppression of Jim Crow, from the brilliant legal war of Thurgood Marshall to the moral courage of Rosa Parks, from the non-violent philosophy of Dr. King to the defiant self-reliance of the Black Panthers. This was the Second Reconstruction. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 were the crowning legislative achievements of the movement. They legally ended Jim Crow and secured political power, finally fulfilling the promise that had been made a century earlier. But this struggle was not the end. It was the blueprint. The tactics, legal victories, and inspiration of the African American civil rights movement would provide the fire for a dozen other groups to demand their own rights. Thank you for watching Part 1. Join us for Part 2 of A Nation Remade, where we explore the expanding movement, including the rise of second-wave feminism, the Chicano movement's fight for farm workers, and the Red Power movement's demand for sovereignty. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Of all the events in Part 1, which do you believe was the single most important turning point? The Brown v. Board decision, the Montgomery Bus Boycott, or the Bloody Sunday March in Selma? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, stay curious.